Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to the global Ukrainian community. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Andrew Wilson, who's an author, a professor in Ukrainian studies at the University College London, and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Andrew. How are you today?
I'm great, and you're good too, I hope, Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. To start off with, can you talk a little bit about your career and professional background?
Well, first off, I hope your listeners can understand my Northern English accent. That's where I'm from. Scottish borders. I mean, couldn't be much further north. Um, my first degree at Oxford was in politics and philosophy, politics in general, philosophy in general. But when I was thinking of doing a PhD in 1990, the big issue of the day was the revolutions that had just happened in Central Europe. Um, so it struck me as a good thing to look at what was going to happen in the then still just about existing USSR. But it was clearly, if it survived at all, going to change into something completely different, largely along national lines. Russia and Ukraine were the two biggest then republics. So I thought something about the relationships between them would be key to the future, which it has been. I mean, I wouldn't say the last 33 years have been one of inevitable conflict, but there are plenty of problems apparent, from way back then. And then that would have been 1990. So a year into my PhD, I went to Kiev, summer of 91, which is obviously a very exciting time to be there. So then I was hooked, I guess.
Andrew, how strong has public support been for the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with his wartime strategy and foreign policy during the Russian invasion? And I guess topically this week, President Zelensky has done a major shakeup in his cabinet. And I'm curious about your reaction to that. Why do you think it happened now? And what do you think the impact will be on that going forward?
Well, I'll take that as two questions, I guess. One about popularity in general and one about the reshuffle. Without personalizing things too much, there is pretty consensual agreement within Ukrainian society now on fundamentals. 85 to 90% back independence, back the war, back uh, war aims as defined by Zelensky. And Zelensky, at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, very much embodied that. So his ratings were 90% as well. Zelensky now has that kind of 90% rating. Zelensky's has slid a bit to somewhere in the 60s, which is still pretty high. And you could interpret that as just a shift in focus. Zelensky personalizes that kind of consensus now. Whereas Zelensky's little slip, I think, is just performance related. There are economic problems. Not everything in the war has gone as hoped. So you see a little slide. I think down to somewhere in the 60s is a small slide, but given the kind of huge popularity that he had, the reshuffle is in large part about trying to reboot that. But there's been talk of this since February, and here we are in September, so it's taken a long time. Partly, of course, and that might be another question, as a kind of substitute for elections. Elections are normally how you rejuvenate power. Um, Ukraine can't hold them. We'll talk about why shortly, I guess. So Zelensky talked about extra energy, kind of reboot metaphors or whatever, and about half the cabinet have been changed. But to my mind, I don't see much of extra energy. I mean, one or two guys were clearly burnt out, some ministers, for understandable reason. But it's much more a symptom of the kind of growing power of the presidential administration, presidential office now, um, and its chief of staff, Yermak. Parliament had to ratify the process, but didn't really initiate it. So in some ways, it shows the kind of passivity of Parliament as well. I mean, it looks like further centralisation of power, um, both around Zelensky and around Yermak, who has many critics, but is seen to be Zelensky's indispensable problem solver. So it's about the lack of elections, about trying to rejuvenate the government, but also about centralising power around the presidency, I think.
Our discussion today is focused on politics in Ukraine during the war. Overall, how do you think politics have changed since Russia invaded the country in February 2022?
Well, initially you had less politics, obviously. Um, Even physically, it wasn't possible for Parliament to sit, certainly not for long periods. So, I mean, we're not back to normal, but Parliament now sits, and at reasonable length. There was initially a huge rally around the flag effect, focus on Zelensky as national leader, and therefore the kind of draining of attention away from everybody else. You had the de facto nationalization of TV in this United News marathon, which basically depoliticized TV, so kind of shrank politics. You still got plenty of politics online or whatever, but you don't kind of have the raucous rivalry through TV that you used to. At the same time, you had, as well as growing approval and popularity of the president, you had growing approval, support for state institutions, which is a new thing in Ukraine. You've had very low ratings for political institutions like parliament, but also ministries, the state in general, if you like. So that kind of rally around the flag effect also applied to the state in general, particularly because it was delivering for ordinary Ukrainians and protecting them. And in all those cases, you've seen big rises and a bit of a fall recently, but not back to the levels that you had before February 2024. There's more consensus in Ukraine, there's more general support for the state, but you are seeing old issues coming back to the surface, but more importantly, new ones related to the war, the conduct of the war, and whatever, which the old parliament, which was elected ages ago in 2019, different world, doesn't really channel or express very well. So you see a lot of demand for new faces, which is a traditional Ukrainian thing. But opinion polls show that not many people expect or would give their support to new parties emerging from within the party system. People would prefer to see, would put their faith in veterans or NGO leaders or people who've been crowdfunding the army. Those are the kind of people who increasingly have a political voice.
Andrew, if the war continues into 2025 and beyond, do you think it will be possible to hold elections in the near term?
Well, let's not talk about the if, because obviously we all hope for speedy victory. So the second part of the question, No. And public opinion says no. More than 80% say elections are impossible, should not be held. Number one reason is safety. Russia would attack the voting process. In fact, given kind of poison of Russian propaganda, it would feel obliged to attack the voting process, supporting the Maidan regime, yeah, voting for the kind of parties that Russia calls Nazi would be seen as would be propagandized as an anti-Russian act. I mean, this would be a horrendous war crime, attacking the voting process, but Russia would do it. So safety is your number one concern. Who votes, where people are, the voting register, a huge number of IDPs and DPs. So organising a fair election would be a huge, presumably post-war operation. Now, the longer it goes on, older Zelensky and Parliament's mandate is. But, I mean, your listeners might be in the US where there are no elections, sorry, where there were elections, beg your pardon, during the First World War and the Second World War. Second World War twice, 1940, 1944. But the continental US wasn't under threat. In the UK, where I am sitting, we had no elections between 1910 and 1918, or between 1935 and 1945. So we survived for 8-10 years without elections, but with politics. So, I mean, that's Ukraine's task. I don't think Ukraine elections are possible anytime soon, but you can have politics without elections.
What has happened to Ukraine's oligarchs during the war? And do you think new oligarchs will emerge when the war ends?
Well, the war has seen an acceleration of a really important, I think, positive trend, the decline of the Ukrainian oligarchs. We used to think these guys would be around forever, survived many presidents, many, at least 2 revolutions, but their influence has actually long been on the wane. Most people point to the obvious stuff, that they've lost wealth and assets physically during the war, which is true. In fact, more than proportionately. A lot of oligarchs' wealth has been in heavy industry, and a lot of it was regionally concentrated in Donbass or Crimea. So Akhmetov's Mariupol steel plant basically doesn't exist anymore. A lot of them have, I mean, they've suffered their total wealth is down by more than half, which is proportionally more than the fall in GDP. But just as important, I think, has been their declining political influence. Most important factor in which is that they don't control TV anymore. Before February 2022, oligarch TV channels had about 3/4 of the national audience. That's now corralled into this United News marathon. And many oligarchs have formally given up their TV, like Akhmetov. And TV was the way that they used to influence politics and the way that they used politics to defend their wealth. That's much more difficult now. And a lot of Ukrainian oligarchs got rich on Russian trade and Russian money, which doesn't happen anymore for obvious reasons. Some of them have left the country, like Medvedchuk. And I think that's a real positive for post-war Ukraine that could have a very different economy. You asked if a new class of oligarchs might emerge. Well, all of those things that I've talked about would have to reverse for that to happen. And I don't see a scenario like you had in the 90s when the oligarchy first emerged in Ukraine out of rigged privatization schemes. There's no big pot of money available at all equivalent to that. Yes, there'll be billions of dollars in reconstruction money, and some of which might be. stone, but it will be pretty well regulated. And if it's coming from international financial organizations, they're not stupid. they'll put proper procedure in place. So I don't see anything that would re-enrich an oligarchy as a class. But there are plenty of problems still with the courts and informal influence in Ukraine that will maintain little bits of oligarchy here and there, but not oligarchy as a big system, I don't.
Andrew, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I did have a final question. What effect do you think Ukraine's internal displaced population will have on future politics and the direction of the country? And secondly, what will happen when Ukrainians return from abroad? What kind of impact will they have on politics?
Ooh, well, we're talking millions in both categories. Huge numbers have been forced to move. How do we know? Well, there are some other countries with big population movements, like Moldova. And interestingly, the experience with how people have left Moldova and work in the EU vote is that they tend to support liberal and pro-European parties because they are living in Europe and they want that to continue. But with Ukraine, displacement by war is obviously an issue in itself. There are big issues of who votes, how that's organized. Plenty of issues directly concerning displaced people, housing, return, viability of the economic viability of the homes that they left and the businesses in the places that they left, affecting whether or not they can go properly home or not. I mean, there's a real risk actually of post-war Ukraine having a very different regional geography unless the temporarily occupied territories are safely reincorporated and the areas next to them also rendered safe. If that is in any doubt, you will see, as now, considerable depopulation of large parts of the east and south, and that really needs to be reversed. A future Ukraine, which is basically the Lviv-Kiev corridor, would not be economically or socially healthy. So we need people to get back to where they used to live, and for there to be viable economies in all those areas, and that there'll be a huge politics around all that, particularly about where the reconstruction money goes, whether it goes to the safe areas or whether it rebuilds the areas that have been destroyed. There'll be a big politics around that, as well as the very, very personal issues of PTSD and so on and so forth, and social care for people who've been displaced or veterans.
Andrew, I want to thank you for joining us today on Krynytsia.
My pleasure.
I have been speaking with Andrew Wilson, an author, professor in Ukrainian studies at University College London, and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. This episode of Krynytsia has been produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.